It is May 8th, and on this date, 663 years ago, King Edward III of England and John II of France negotiated the terms of the Treaty of Brétigny, ending 26 years of conflict between the House of Plantagenet and the House of Valois over the throne of France. In the treaty, Edward III renounced his claims to the throne of France in exchange for French recognition of his holdings in Calais and Aquitaine. The treaty didn't, as they had hoped, put an end to the conflict that would eventually become known as the 100 Years' War, but it did significantly change European history, was the end, most historians argue, of the first phase of the 100 Years' War. But perhaps what was most interesting is that the treaty was not driven by a military victory from either side, but rather, European history was changed 3 weeks earlier by a hailstorm. It is one of the great hailstorms of history that deserves to be remembered.
Edward III had found significant success in his bid to claim the crown of France, with significant English victories in Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, a victory so complete that John II of France had been captured. But John's son, the Dauphin, had refused to accept the terms of the Treaty of London that had been forced upon his father after his capture. In response, in 1360, Edward raised a force of some 10,000 men, the largest army that had so far been raised in the war, and rampaged across France. In an attempt to force the French into a decisive battle, he besieged the cathedral city of Chartres. But on April 13th, Easter Monday, tragedy befell the English army. Contemporary chronicler Jean Froissart wrote, "There happened such a storm and violent tempest of thunder and hail, which fell upon the English army, that it seemed as if the world was come to an end. The hailstones were so large as to kill men and beasts, and the boldest were frightened." A 2020 edition of The Guardian writes, "Panic set in when giant hailstones started falling, causing the horses to scatter, along with freezing rain. The army reportedly lost more than 1,000 men to the combined effects of lightning, hailstones, stampede, and sudden chill, more than had been killed at the Battle of Crécy." The website of the Chapel Archives of Windsor Castle explains, one chronicler described it as a foul day, full of mist and hail, so that men died on horseback. 2 of the English leaders were killed, and a panic set in among the troops, which had no shelter from the storm. One of those leaders was Sir Guy of Beauchamp, heir apparent to the Earl of Warwick, who suffered for 2 weeks before dying of his injuries. Edward III, whom 17th century biographer Joshua Barnes described as devout to God, bountiful to clergy, gracious to his people, merciful to the poor, and valiant, just, merciful, temperate, and wise, took the storm as a sign from God and resolved to end the war. Barnes wrote, "Thus armed fierce Edward did his troops advance, resolved to waste ye stubborn realm of France. But gracious heaven stops his enraged hand, and loudly pleads in thunder for the land. Edward obeys his great Creator's will. To yield to heaven is but to conquer still."
It isn't exactly clear how large the hailstones were, or how many of the supposed 1,000 men and 7,000 horses killed were killed by the hail as opposed to the lightning or the cold or the stampede. And of course, Edward's decision to seek a peace treaty was based as much in his belief that the storm was a message from God as it was the actual impacts of the weather. But in compelling the treaty that resulted in 9 years of peace, the Black Monday hailstorm of 1360 could arguably be called the most important hailstorm in history.
But it was not the only such storm to impact history. On July 13th, 1788, a hailstorm struck near Paris, France. The British ambassador to France, Lord Dorset, sent a report to the Foreign Secretary. "A storm of thunder, lightning, and hail which was experienced in the environs of Paris last Sunday was so uncommonly violent, and has done so much mischief in those parts where its full force was felt, that I am induced to give your lordship such particulars of it as have come to my knowledge." He told the secretary that the stones were of a size and weight never before heard of in this country, some of them measuring 16 inches in circumference. The storm was so violent that the King of France was obliged to stop on the road and take shelter in a farmhouse. And the storm was deadly. He writes, 2 men were found dead upon the road, and a horse so bruised that it was determined to kill him from a motive of humanity, to put him from his misery. But there was another toll as well. He writes, "No computation has yet been made of the losses that have been sustained, but it is certain that a country of at least 30 leagues in circumference is entirely laid waste. The unfortunate sufferers not only lose the crops of the present year, but of 3 or 4 years to come, the vines being entirely cut up. The timing of this destruction to crops over such a large area could hardly have been worse. France was already suffering from a significant drought and resulting famine. The London Sunday Times opined in 2019 that the hailstorm destroyed much of the meager supplies of grain for Paris, and the price of bread rose. It was a dire political and economic situation, and with most of the population facing food shortages, it helped to sow the seeds for the French Revolution in 1789. While there were many factors leading up to the French Revolution, an ill-timed hailstorm was among those pushing a desperate population into revolt. While the timing of these storms exaggerated their historical impact, they are certainly not unique. Hail is not uncommon in Europe, with significant storms reported throughout recorded history across the continent. A particularly violent hailstorm in eastern England called the Great Hailstorm of August 1843 produced hail that one abbot described as large as pigeons' eggs. The Cambridge Chronicle described the storm as a storm of thunder and hail more terrific in its character and more disastrous in its results than any by which this district has been visited upon within the memory of living man, or indeed of which history supplies us with an account. Astoundingly, BBC Oxford notes, there were 2 remarkable instances of boiling kettles being holed by the force of hailstones which descended chimneys.
And of course, the threat still remains. In fact, 2022 was a record year for hail in Europe. The European Severe Storms Laboratory logged 8,224 large hail events in Europe last year. 18 of those included hail that was more than 10 centimeters in diameter. The laboratory notes that in all, 215 people were injured by hail in Europe last year, and 1 person in Spain was killed. Insured losses due to hail in France in 2022 represented a record 4.8 billion euros.
Those record economic losses demonstrate the connections between human activity and natural disasters. The New York Post explains, in addition to the increased storminess, analysts also blamed record losses on inflation, increased urbanization, and an apparent increase in vulnerability made up by an increase in solar panel usage. If hailstorms in more modern times caused more economic damage due to urbanization, hailstorms in ancient times might have been much more deadly because of the lack of structures for protection. An example might be Rupken Lake in India. Atlas Obscura writes that in 1942, bones were discovered after summer ice melted in a lake some 1,600 feet above sea level. Suspecting the skeletons might have been the remains of Japanese soldiers who had died of exposure while sneaking through India, Atlas Obscura writes, the British government, terrified of a Japanese land invasion, sent a team of investigators to determine if it was true. Instead, they determined that the skeletons were much older than the ongoing Second World War. Yet, Atlas Obscura notes, they had no idea what had killed over 200 people in this small valley. The possible explanation, uncovered by an expedition in 2004, Atlas Obscura writes, was hail. All the bodies had died in a similar way, from blows to the head. However, the short, deep cracks in the skulls appeared to be the result not of weapons, but rather of something rounded. The bodies also had only wounds on their heads and shoulders, as if the blows had all come from directly above. Referring to a local folk song about outsiders being punished by a goddess, Atlas Obscura concludes, trapped in the valley with nowhere to hide or seek shelter, the hard-as-iron cricket ball-sized hailstones came by the thousands, resulting in the traveler's bizarre sudden death. The remains lay in the lake for 1,200 years until their discovery. However, a genetic study published in the journal Nature Communications in 2019 threw cold water on the assumption that the skeletons of the lake represented a single group of travelers killed in a hailstorm. Rather, the authors conclude, the skeletons consisted of different groups that had been deposited over several events. We find that the Rupken skeletons belong to 3 genetically distinct groups that were deposited during multiple events, separated in time by approximately 1,000 years. These findings refute previous suggestions that the skeletons of Rupken Lake were deposited in a single catastrophic event, the authors write. However, while the evidence doesn't support the claim that all the individuals died in a hailstorm, it is quite possible that some did, the authors write. We view the hypothesis of a mass death during a pilgrimage event as a plausible explanation for at least some of the individuals. So while the theory that these bones represent a mass death due to hail has not weathered the storm, at least some of the bones might represent the very real risk of death if caught in the open in a large hailstorm. The Weather Network notes that hailstorms can absolutely kill when the hail is large enough, and the human cost can be staggering. And Atlas Obscura notes that large hail falls at around 100 miles per hour, weighs as much as a pound, force is the equivalent of something throwing a masonry brick at your head, which is more than enough force to kill you. A fact which struck home in Moradabad, India in 1788. The World Meteorological Organization's World Weather and Climate Extremes Archive notes the highest documented mortality due to hail was a 30th of April, 1888 storm there. The London Times reported in May of that year that India has been visited by a series of phenomenal storms. At Moradabad, 150 deaths are reported, caused chiefly by hailstones. In Lower Bengal, at Raibati, 2,000 huts were destroyed and 20 persons reported to have been killed and 200 severely injured. A complete reference to this event was given in A.W. Greely's 1880 book, American Weather. Greely's account came from the Director General of Meteorology from the India Meteorological Department, Mr. John Elliott, Esquire. The account states that a terrific storm of hail followed, breaking all the windows and glass doors. The walls shook. It was nearly dark outside, and hailstones of an enormous size were dashed down with a force which I have never seen anything to equal. There is not a single house in the civil station which did not sustain the most serious injury. Then the details get grim. 230 deaths in all have been reported up to the present time. The total number may be safely put as under 250. The majority of the deaths were caused by the hail. Men caught in the open without shelter were simply pounded to death by the hail. 14 bodies were found in the racecourse. Most of the deaths were on the bare and level plains around the station where people were caught unaware. More than one marriage party was caught by the storm near the banks of the river and were annihilated. The police report that 1,600 head of cattle, sheep, and goats were killed. While the World Meteorological Organization considers the Moradabad storm to have been the deadliest hailstorm in documented history, its weather historians did find competition when searching for that title. Notably, a storm in China in 1932. Headline of a story in the New York Times on June 23rd of that year reads, 200 die in hailstorm. Stones as big as baseballs in Honan, China. The story reports that the storm raged for 2 hours, razing houses, crops, and trees, with dispatches telling of 200 persons killed and thousands injured. How common is severe hail? On this date, May 8th in 1784, the first known account in the United States of deadly hail was reported to have occurred in Winnsboro, South Carolina. An account in the South Carolina Gazette reported hailstones, or rather pieces of ice, measured about 9 inches in circumference. It killed several people, a great number of sheep, lambs, geese, and the feathered inhabitants of the woods, without number. Also on this day, May 8th in 1981, what the website AccuWeather describes as arguably the worst hailstorm ever to hit the Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas area occurred. AccuWeather notes that hailstones as large as grapefruit, combined with 100-mile-per-hour winds, blasted the Metroplex. Hail accumulated to a depth of 8 inches in Cedar Hill. Damage was estimated at $200 million. The afternoon of May 8, 2017, brought a hailstorm to Denver, Colorado, that did so much damage that the chief building official of the city of Wheat Ridge told the local news station, "I don't think anyone has seen this level of damage. I mean, it was daunting." In fact, the storm caused so much damage that, AccuWeather notes, as a result of the extensive damage caused around the Denver metro area, the storm became not only the costliest hailstorm in Colorado history, but also the costliest catastrophe in state history, according to Rocky Mountain Insurance Information Association. And those were just notable hailstorms that occurred on May 8th.
Hail is yet another example of how human history is subject to Mother Nature. And while severe thunderstorms with large hail can occur almost anywhere on Earth, there's a particular swath in the United States, from Texas across Colorado into Wyoming, where conditions are particularly conducive, earning that area the sobriquet, Hail Alley. The Weather Channel knows that when it comes to severe weather, while tornadoes tend to get the headlines, hail tends to cause more damage in a given year. And just to underline the point, the day that I was making this episode, May 7th, 2023, hail fell on my house, and hail was recorded in Iowa that was described as large as tennis balls. And on the day that this episode airs, May 8th, 2023, the National Weather Service is warning of severe thunderstorms that might include damaging hail across several states in the Midwest. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.